Hello, everyone. My name is Renata, and today I'm here with my very special guest and friend, Jules Alvarado. She is a healing expert in the area of trauma, relationship, and employee well-being, and she's also the author of the book, The Quest for Peace in a Broken World. Hello, Jules.
Hi, Renata. Thanks for having me on today.
Welcome. I think the title of your book introduces as well into our today's topic, the broken world we live in. And it's sad to say, but sometimes I do think that we live in a world that has very little capacity for healing, that we undermine healing actually, and the society is somehow not orientated into that direction. We have very quick, like a lot of quick fix system. We know how to distract ourselves. We know how to get better, but I don't know, using addiction, for instance, or shopping or eating or drinking. But when there's little support and little culture of really enhancing healing from within, especially when we talk about our traumas that we all have from our childhood, even if we don't know that, somehow we still got traumatized. So what do you think about it, and how do you happen to care about these topics of trauma and relationship?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you very much for inviting this conversation and opening up a conversation that I think is critical for humanity at large, and that we don't often talk about. You hear a lot about trauma and we hear a lot about healing, but I find the majority of the conversations that are being had are still really at the surface level of perhaps how trauma impacts the brain and the body. And we can talk about that because those impacts are real and they're toxic and they're hard. But I think there's a deeper impact of trauma. And the way that I came into my concern and my care and compassion was initially having my own children and recognizing with the birth of my first son and then my second son and then my third child, who is a daughter, and my fourth child, who's a daughter, and then fostering and caring for many, many children in our home over about 20 years, that the role that I played as mother ignited inside of me both something that was missing, that I found myself trying to fulfill in the relationship with my children, who are all now in their 30s, by the way, don't have young children anymore. But also left me, Renata, looking for other human beings who I believed were having the same experiences as I was and willing to dive into, willing to explore, being pushed to that edge as a mother, being pushed to that edge as a partner, being pushed to that edge. I'm also a therapist in trauma and attachment work. And so being pushed to the edge with clients who were suffering that I hadn't yet developed the capacity to see into deeply enough to help shine a light on a path of healing for them. And so there was this intersection between the recognition of my own traumas being energetically kind of exploding inside of me at times, which I wasn't aware that that's what they were. I just felt I was pushed to the edge at times. And then also a deep concern for the people who I was sitting with. And this was 25, 30 years ago. The people who I was sitting with that I felt such a deep ache to serve, and yet felt that my service to them wasn't hitting the mark. The books on neurobiology and the physiology of trauma and the black and white science of it just wasn't hitting the mark. And so that's where I feel my interest really began to expand and deepen into what was I missing, both in myself, in the children who we were fostering, my own children, certainly, and the clients who I was serving. And that led me into dimensions and worlds and faiths and religions and mysticism that I had not been introduced to. I grew up as a devout Catholic in a family who practiced Catholicism, and that was all I knew and all I had been taught. And moving outside of the box of some power outside of me that would hold punishment or reward over me left me feeling that there was no hope to explore, to expand, to evolve, to become, because if I had already committed atrocious sins, which I was taught that I had already committed those because of my own early trauma experiences, then what hope was there for me coming into parenting my own children? And so as I began to expand and explore the mystical space, that mystical bond between a mother and their child, and that undeniable and indescribable bond, feeling, sense that we have about our children, I also began to wake up to how my parents became who they were as parents, and to understand the suffering in their journeys that compelled some of the suffering in our home. And all of that led to just a beautiful, organic unfolding of forgiveness and compassion and grace and deeper love than I think I had ever felt, both for my parents and my children, and then for myself. And so the ache to explore and feel more deeply those connections that I long for outside of the human dimension, outside of just physical touch, which is very important, but something deeper inside, became my mission, my journey. And I think that's how I've landed where I am today.
I think most of us get defensive when we hear this word trauma, because we just kind of deny it, or we don't want to be associated with it, I guess. And we just, no, my family was very normal. I had a very normal childhood. I didn't get any trauma. How do you see trauma? What is trauma for you?
You know, it's interesting, Renata. I remember when I was finishing my first graduate degree in developmental psychology, and we were in a practicum as we were considering what field we wanted to go to work in. And my advisor was sitting across from me as I had just finished a session being supervised, and it was very challenging and painful. And she said to me, you know, if you could work in any field when you leave school, where would you work? And I said, anywhere except child abuse. I am not interested in, I do not want to work in child abuse. And this was at the end of my graduate schooling, the first time around. And she said to me, that's where you need to work. This is where you're going to find your edge. And I'll never forget it. She said to me, this is where you're going to find yourself. Because I, like many people who you just described, grew up telling everyone the truth that I had believed myself. I had created a narrative in my mind that we were the most loving, normal, healthy family. My father had one job for 40 years. My mother stayed home and took care of us. We were middle-class Americans in mid-America. We were successful, right, by all traditional definitions. My siblings were successful academically and athletically. My parents were very involved in the community. Both of my parents were very involved in all of our educational efforts. And yet I was the one struggling. I was the one not making it through high school. I was struggling to stay connected in any way to myself or to my family. And so I had to create the narrative, because if I had been willing then to explore why I was not successful in my own right, not by anyone else's definition, although certainly I was not successful by my family's definition, and all my siblings were. But I would have had to look at where that came from, and it came from within my family. And that was not permission, consciously or unconsciously, that I felt like I had. Now I recognize, Renata, that I did not want my mother and father to know what their sons had done to their daughters. To me, it felt like more of a betrayal to pull my parents through that knowing than to bear it myself. Now, certainly that was unconscious until I was probably in my mid 30s. But I couldn't fathom that there was trauma in my family. It made no sense to me that there was trauma in my family. And interestingly, the day after my mother died very young of cancer. My mother's an immigrant to this country. She's an immigrant from Beirut, Lebanon. She was never able to go back to her country because of war and her family being torn apart. And there was always this deep sadness in my mother, but also a very deep love. Like my mother's hugs could make everything go away. My mother's being in her presence, you just felt like your world somehow was going to be okay. And yet there was a deep sadness, right, that ran through her, that collective trauma, the ancestral trauma that she was carrying that I knew nothing about then. But I knew that if I were to expose what had happened to me before I was ready to process it or integrate it, that I could potentially expose my family to something we weren't prepared for. The day after her funeral, my sister and I were in the car driving together. And my sister looked over at me and asked me very nonchalantly, "Hey, Jules, do you remember?" And the narrative started pouring out. And I was 32. And it was the very first time my sister and I had ever said out loud to each other what we had both lived through for many years of our childhood. And it took my mom dying for me to feel like I had permission or enough safety. So I think that many of us, and I know this is important for people I sit with, and perhaps for any of you listening to us either today or at any point over the span of your life, it's terrifying sometimes, absolutely terrifying, to look at the experiences of our lifetime that have brought us to where we are. And our mind and our body are programmed to protect us from that, right? So these experiences of trauma that shut down certain functions of the brain and activate other areas of the brain are beautifully designed to protect us from that overwhelming feeling that leaves us helpless and hopeless. And so talking about those experiences as if we acknowledged the trauma brings us back into a truth that our nervous system may not yet be prepared to handle. And I believe that. I believe we come face to face with the truth in our lives at the right time, in the right way, with the right people. I don't believe it always feels right. Right? It doesn't feel right, but I do believe that there are protective forces all around us and wisdom within us, around us, and outside of us that allow what we are prepared to hear and handle and integrate. Immediately after my sister began to share those words, I was driving, and Renata, I had to pull off the highway, get out of my car, and I was physically ill for about 20 minutes. I just physically, literally continued to throw up on the side of the road. And when I look back at that now, and with beautiful people who've helped me through my own journey, all of the toxic energy that I was holding and the secrets that I thought were protecting my family, I had been holding on to for decades, came pouring out of me just at the acknowledgement that perhaps there was something that my sister and I were ready to look at. And so I would say to any of you wondering about this for yourselves, there's such a stigma associated with trauma. There is such a stigma associated with anything less than what our society and our cultures teach us, our strength and resilience, and this ability to continue to march on. And yet, as we march on and we march through our experiences, we have unconscious memories that compel the way we engage with the world. And if we don't bring those memories up to the conscious level of awareness, they take over. They determine our relationships. They determine our capacity to feel safe. They determine our attachment style as adults. They determine our willingness to open our hearts today that may have been protected and wounded long ago. They determine how we parent. I was such a helicopter parent, unconsciously, so afraid to let my children have freedom in the world. But I didn't recognize that until I began to recognize my own and be able to connect those dots around how I was becoming a parent, really forced by this unconscious narrative that I had flowing through me. So I think it is hard to look at our trauma, and it's scary to look at our trauma, and it is not safe to process our trauma with everyone. Right? It is so important to find the right person in the right environment at the right time as you begin to tell your story, so that that level of safety and acceptance and the sensation for you that you feel met, that you feel heard, that you feel believed, that you have a trustworthy other, those are the relationships through which we begin to heal our trauma. And so I do believe we still have a defensiveness around talking about trauma and what trauma really is and how trauma unpacks itself within our mind, our body, and our spirit.
I think what you just said about this culture supporting us being always brave, always successful, it's what gets us defensive, because acknowledging that somehow I might have got traumatized, that's like saying I'm weak. I don't have my place. I'm not the leader. I'm not number one. I'm not the I don't know what. But that means I'm somehow a victim. And in our society, victim is not seen as good as someone who wins. So it's like this vicious circle. You don't want to go there because there is nothing in the society who supports vulnerability or who supports going deep into ourselves. And I remember, and I think everyone knows this phrase by Gabor Mate, who said that trauma is something that happens within us. That's not to say that what happens outside us or what is done to our bodies doesn't matter. Obviously, that matters. But somehow trauma robs us of our feeling of authenticity, that somehow we betray ourselves because we have to adopt a strategy to survive. So that might mean we suppress our feelings, or we become people pleasers, or we somehow try to survive in what happens within us. And then we lose authenticity, we lose ourselves.
And isn't that, this sensation of, if I was victimized, then I won't be seen, especially for women, right? And I think this is still true around the world today. Trauma in men has a different impact. And I know that for men, it's even harder at times to come into the truth of their traumas. The impact when they do is different, I believe, than when women do, because we're already coming in behind the game, if you will, in most cultures, just by being born a woman. And so to come into a position like yours or mine, where we have strength, and certainly we have tenacity and resilience, we're still here, we're holding space for women around the world and parents around the world and victims of trauma around the world. And yet to step into our own gives us the belief that we will be seen as the victim. And, I think it's, for me and for many people who are listening to us, that the truth is, I was held victim until I began to acknowledge the truth of my life. I was a victim to what had happened to me. I was a victim to the trauma that was in the unconscious cells of my body. I was a victim to what they had done to me. And as a matter of fact, they held power over me most of my life because what they had done was still living through me because I hadn't integrated it. The shame for many of us who have experienced many kinds of trauma is that in some way there's something wrong with me. Like I was responsible in some way for what they did, or why didn't I stop it? You know, people ask this all the time. Why didn't you tell your mom? Why didn't you get help? Why didn't you tell someone? And I want us to turn that question around. You know, instead of asking those who've been traumatized, why didn't you tell? I want us to ask, why did the perpetrators do what they did? Because those of us who were in the grips of that victimization, remember, the brain and body immediately takes us into defense mode to protect ourselves. We shut down any capacity to believe that we are worth anything other than what is happening, especially for children under the age of about 10. Our brain hasn't developed the capacity before the age of about 10 to not only really understand the roles between our perpetrators and ourselves, but we also don't understand where the responsibility is. We haven't developed the capacity, that internal capacity for regulation and responsibility to recognize the power within us and outside of us. And so I think that fear of victimization for me got very turned around once I recognized I am no longer a victim. They have no power over me. Their narrative, their treatment of me is theirs. I will not make what they did to me mine. But as Gabor beautifully says, those experiences have landed in my nervous system. And so as my nervous system grew up and developed through that, my nervous system also developed this need to defend, right? So as you said beautifully, we become kind of stuck developmentally in that fight mode or flight mode or freeze mode or appease mode or completely, dorsal vagal, and we shut down entirely. We have no capacity to defend and protect ourselves. But the scary piece about trauma is that we don't know that. We don't know that's the state we're in. I didn't know that until my sister spoke the words she did, and everything came tumbling down, and then it took finding someone safe to help me see that my defense mechanisms that I thought were helping me move through the world safely were actually keeping me from the love that I desired. My fight mode that I thought was protecting me in my 30s was destroying my adult relationships. My need for control, my need to be right, my need to win the argument, my need to protect my environment at all times, my need to protect everybody in my space at all times. That intensity about me was actually destroying what I was looking for in this lifetime. And what I was looking for was safe, peaceful, regenerative, reparative, connected love. And I was fighting the very thing that I said I wanted. And so for those of us who fear that, being seen as the victim, I just invite us to recognize that there is a voice inside each of us that knows the truth. And sometimes we have to put her away. Sometimes we have to quiet her. And so to hear this voice of inner wisdom that has been with us every step of the way. She knows everything that's ever happened. She's been with us from the beginning. She'll be with us until our last breath. But sometimes we've quieted her to the point where her wisdom is so buried underneath the trauma that we can't hear her. And I believe part of, it's why I don't believe talk therapy is the way into the deepest aspects of who we are. We can't use the same narrative to get out of the state we're in that got us into the state we're in. We can't use the same mind and brain and thoughts to get out of this place that got us into this place. It's something deeper within us. And it's in that essence. It's in the energy. It's in my wisdom voice. Being quiet enough, long enough, whether it's prayer or contemplation or being with a safe other or meditation or a yoga practice or a breathing practice or a mindful practice that allows us to turn our energy back into ourselves instead of the world that we're defending ourselves from. But to turn that awakening and awareness back into ourselves can feel really scary for people who have experienced trauma. And so it can be a slow process. It can be a scary process. But for anyone who's listening to us today, it's also the only way to freedom. It is the only way to gain true freedom and regain this capacity for meeting your authentic true self, your loving self, your gentle self, your graceful self, your compassionate self, your self that wants to be deeply connected to other beings that you've defended yourself from for so long. She's just waiting for you. She's waiting for you to bring her back online and for you to love her and honor her so that she can be in relationship to you. And your wholeness, right? Our whole being, our whole healing can then come into authentic relationship with others. And I think most importantly, my children. Most importantly, my own children. That's where the real healing began, was becoming the mother who I really want to be with my children. And then that becomes extrapolated into all of my relationships.
Weren't you afraid to pass on your traumas to your children, especially when you had this decision to not just be a mom, but also be an adoptive mom, a foster mom? And weren't you afraid that, but I am a mess inside me and I'm
Yeah.
gonna pass that on to my children?
Yes.
How did you deal with that?
You know, I think we're all afraid of that, right? We're also afraid of not being the best mom and giving our kids the best opportunity we can. And this is the reason that we need to find someone safe to work through our own stories, because until my secrets were no longer secrets, right? So my sister had held them for decades. I had held them we hadn't even spoken to each other. And we were victims at the same time to the same people in our family. And we had not. But imagine the shame we were carrying, that we couldn't even speak to each other about it. Once that dam broke and I recognized the weight of carrying that secret, the first piece that I went into therapy about, and everyone's journey is unique and sacred. I started in talk therapy. I didn't know what else to do. I found a therapist who worked in sexual abuse. It was more traumatizing for me, Renata, to be in her presence. She should not have been a therapist. And it took me a long time to believe, after that relationship with her, that I was still worth finding somebody who could help me work through these nightmares and flashbacks, and what was happening in my body when someone would walk up behind me, what would happen when my children came into my bedroom because they had had a nightmare and they would barely touch my arm to wake me up, and I would fly out of bed, which terrified them. And those were my post-trauma responses that I didn't know how to regulate. But I did finally find somebody, and it was a shaman. It was somebody who worked in mysticism, but also understood, and I think this is important, understood the neurobiological, what was happening in my brain was connected to what was happening in my body. And it was held at an unconscious level of memory, in that state level memory where our traumas are held. I didn't know anything about that. And so this person was able to help me connect the dots. Like, he helped me understand why I jump when someone walks up behind me. He helped me understand why I was so afraid to let my children spend the night at someone else's home. He helped me understand why we built a home with 10 bedrooms so that no child in our home would ever have to share a bedroom. I was so terrified of that we built a ridiculously massive home with 10 bedrooms in it. So no one would ever have to be together. And of course, I didn't sleep at night because I was monitoring everybody's rooms, terrified of what might happen. He helped me connect those dots. And then here's the important piece. He helped me honor that part of me. He helped me really love that part of me that was protecting others. He helped me understand where she came from. And then he helped me learn how to quiet down the scary part, the touching base with what happened in my body when I got quiet, why I started sweating when I first began to meditate, why I judged myself so harshly that I couldn't quiet my thoughts when I began to meditate. And out of that process of learning to be safe in my own body came this is a very personal decision. I am not recommending to anyone how they handle this. I'm sharing my journey with you. In that moment or two with him, I decided I would no longer carry secrets. And first of all, that my husband at the time needed to know what had happened. I hadn't told him. My children needed to know why we didn't have a relationship with their uncles. They didn't need to know the details. They were all in high school, moving into early college when this came about for me. And so I brought my whole family together and told them the truth without the details that they didn't need to know, but the truth. And that I was going to stop it in my generation. This was not going to be passed down. We weren't going to hold secrets. We weren't going to harm one another. And I was going to learn to step into a space of freedom with them. And I needed them to know why it was so scary for me. And the relationship with and now as adults, I could not have crossed that bridge into this very sacred connection with my adult children if I were still carrying those secrets. But I had to be ready to know that it was stopping with me. It was absolutely stopping with me. It also empowered me for the children in our home who we were caring for. It empowered me in a different way to help them come to terms with what they were going to choose to do with their secrets. It did not compel me to try to convince them. I don't try to convince anyone, not my clients, my family, my loved ones, but I do offer them options, that there are options outside of this really scary world that we're defending ourselves from. The world is not scary to me anymore. Is it hurting? Yeah. Is there a collective unconscious trauma right now hanging over all of us? Yes. Are there some very wounded crevices, deep crevices in our world today? Yes. But I also believe we can learn to anchor in to our wisdom. When we find that wisdom within us in the most uncertain, terrifying times, we can anchor in to a true resilience, not the resilience I thought I had when I was fighting and defensive, but a true resilience about how I see life today and how I see love today and how I see relationship today and how I see healing today. We can anchor into that in the most uncertain times. And that's one of the most beautiful, I think, outcomes of making the choice to work through our own trauma stories.
When we begin this journey of healing from trauma, we can't it's very hard not to hope that it will go away. Like we somehow commit to do whatever it takes, but when we have this hope that I'm gonna be healed for good and I'm not gonna feel any more imprint of this trauma. And I think it's important to tell people who are listening to us that that's not really how it works. I mean, you can't really get rid of those old imprints in your body. It still stays in there. It's just that maybe it's not that tyrannic as it used to be. And also we are conscious of it. And you can somehow it becomes softer, but you still, it's like it still stays in you, right? It's not gone forever.
Yeah, I love these points that you are courageously addressing about our healing journey. And this is what I meant, Renata. And this is why I so honor your presence in the field and the work that you're doing. Your human beingness has a deep wisdom to it, because you've been on your own healing journey, as I have. And again, I think these are indications of that wisdom that get louder and louder. You're absolutely right. We are in the human condition. We are in the human condition until we take our last breath and our energy transforms into a new condition. But right now, we're still in a sack of bones and veins and nervous system and peptide receptors in our brain and neurons that are firing rapidly every millisecond. And those impulses from our brain into our body are imprinted from our very early trauma experiences. And so day before yesterday, I was standing at the kitchen sink doing dishes. And I tend to move into a very awake meditation when I'm in mundane tasks. So I'm grateful for the dish when I'm washing the dish. I'm grateful for the food that I ate off of that dish. I'm grateful for the people who made sure that food was in my grocery store. I'm grateful for their families who may not have had the people who made sure that food was available to me in a grocery store. And that keeps me in a conscious state, a more mindful state, even through mundane tasks. And so, as you can imagine, when I'm standing at my sink doing dishes, I'm in my body, I'm mindful, I'm fairly emotionally regulated. But my partner came up behind me and just put her arms around me, and my whole body, I just came out of my whole body turned around so quickly. And in that moment, this is what happens when we do our trauma work. The imprint was still there, but in that moment, I was able to move back to my breathing. I was able to ground myself into the room I was in. I can very quickly look for 3 colors. I can orient myself back to time, space very quickly. I can feel her, see her, smell her, touch her, and quickly get back into my body. And so I think that's what you're referring to. That imprint, I've done all this work and the imprint is still there because my nervous system was imprinted. The difference is the reaction time softens quickly into a responsiveness to myself. So that quick reaction that my nervous system has might always be there, Renata. It doesn't last as long. It's not as intense. It doesn't happen. Sometimes I don't jump out of my skin at all. And sometimes I still do. And I wish I could tell you why. The mystery of the human nervous system, or at least you might be able to tell us why, but I don't know why. Sometimes my nervous system can remain fairly regulated, and sometimes that level of dysregulation can just take over like that as I get myself reoriented, regrounded, re-anchored, regulated back down.
What I love in your work is that you always emphasize about taking agency of our lives. So often we define ourselves by what happened to us, and we stay in that past narrative about what has been done to us, what they did to us. And you always say that that part we cannot change. Happened what happened, but we must have the ownership of what happens to us from today, how we define ourselves. If we take agency of our lives, we take responsibility of our lives, how we're gonna live from now on, what story we're gonna tell about ourselves. Can we talk a little bit about this part, about owning what happened, but in an empowering way, instead of just blaming others and then feeling victim, and that doesn't lead nowhere.
And I think, again, here's another just true space that it's important for those who are calling themselves providers or therapists or clinicians or conduits to the healing for others, that we recognize that we don't want to bypass the truth of what happened. I don't want us to pretend it didn't happen. No spiritual bypassing here. No pretending everything is perfectly fine in this moment, because obviously I jumped out of my skin just yesterday or day before. I don't want to pretend, invalidate, or minimize. So I'd like to preface what I'm about to say with that. This is not about minimizing what happened to you. This is not about taking away the experiences that you have survived. This is not about not believing you. This is not about not believing the impact that these experiences still have on us. It's not about passing any of that up, but it is about being able and this is part of the trauma work, that when we are in the trauma narrative, we don't feel empowered. We don't own our experience. We are still victims. We are still blaming. I blamed the people who harmed me for decades. And anytime you blame someone else for where you are in this moment, you are giving them control. You are saying, I blame you for who I am today. You have power over who I am today. And when I began to really think about, these people had power over me for the most important critical years of my life, why would I still give them power over me today? They did what they did. I also have to ask myself, how did they come to do those things? They weren't born to know how to do the things they did to me. What happened to them that they did these things to me? And as I began to look at kind of that generational piece, right, our ancestral piece, I recognize that my anger at them, my blaming them, this many years later, that deep resentment I had toward them was keeping me held victim. I was victimizing myself the way they had once victimized me. I was keeping myself in a place of fear the way they had kept me in a place of fear. I was keeping myself afraid of speaking the truth the way they created fear in me about speaking the truth. So I was still under their power decades later. And as I began to recognize that really they only have the power over me today that I give them. Yes, they had power over me. They had complete power over me at one point. That's true. But do they really today? No, not unless I give it to them. And this is where our work begins. Owning our experience is really scary when that means looking at how we've become who we are. That means looking at the details of what happened to me. That means sitting with my sister and memories coming back up that were holding me captive for decades. It also meant hearing someone else say to me, Jules, that's exactly how it happened. You are not crazy. You are not making this up. You are not, this did happen. And do you remember when this happened, Jules? And for me to have some sense of validation of, oh my gosh, I do remember that. I do remember that. Wow, like this flood. And as I was able to own my story no longer owned me. The narrative that had owned me for the first half of my life, I'm in my 60s now, it didn't own me anymore. I got to the point where I could tell all the details of my story, talk about exactly at least the memories I have of what happened, how I felt when it happened, how I survived what was happening. And those experiences no longer take me over. I don't tremble. My body's not shaking as I'm sitting here talking with you about it. The memories are the story of what happened then. They're not memories so alive in my body anymore that they take me over. And that's one of the beautiful pieces of healing our trauma. The narrative changes And the narrative becomes true resilience and true empowerment and true owning who I am today. This is hard for many of us in early stages. It was certainly hard for me to hear this years ago, Renata. The truth is, if it hadn't been for everything that happened, I wouldn't be sitting here with you today. I wouldn't have the capacity to have looked at that these same experiences happened in my mother and my father's generation. And as I began to explore it, it happened in their parents' generations. And both of their parents were immigrants as well. Right. So I am just a blend of many different cultures, living as someone who looks like a white woman. I'm half Lebanese, half German Irish, which is my fair skin and green eyes, but from parents whose parents and grandparents had carried the same legacy. And I will be darned if I was going to carry that legacy to my kids. And if I hadn't been willing to look at what had happened to me, I don't think I would have explored generations past. I wouldn't have known this. And to now be able to change the narrative that my kids will not carry into their future. They will not carry this generational trauma to their children. They will not carry, it's done. It's stopped here. And that took some hard work, some scary work. I wouldn't trade it. I wouldn't trade it for the world. And it's an honor for me to sit with anyone at any point in their journey, not to push them to another stage, just to create a container of safety, as a sacred, safe container to explore what we each choose to do with our own narrative. So we do come to the place where we own it, we're empowered, we embody it. It is ours. It doesn't own us anymore, so that we can speak this to others who are now on their journey of healing.
As you were talking, I thought about one last part I would like to address, if I may. It's how we navigate relationship with those people who hurt us. One thing is to own our story, but then how do we navigate the relationship with those who hurt us? It's of course it's a personal decision and it depends on what happened, but somehow we get lost in one part of us, especially the part who understands. As you said, I know that people who did that to me, some terrible things happened to them too. And as you understand, you might tend to somehow stay in relationship because of that understanding. But some other parts in yourself might be not willing to do that. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, and here's the courage I so often see in you again, Renata. And first, I think the most important response is what you've already articulated beautifully. You and I don't have the right to suggest to anyone else what they should do. I think that we can offer our stories as an example, and then a safe space for each person to make their own sacred decision. I remember the early work. I'm in my 60s, so I don't know the age of the listeners to us right now, but in my early work, I remember Melody Beattie writing about, how we, the compassionate ones, the highly sensitive ones, which most of us who are going to be drawn to your work and my work are, at times our compassion for others' trauma can create a level of codependency in us that enables some very toxic relationship to continue, because we believe we can help them heal. We can fix them. We can offer them a cure. If our love is big enough, we can stay in relationship and somehow everything will be fine. And there are times when that might happen if both parties are willing to engage in the depth of work. But often it ends up leaving us in a toxic relationship where we're wounded. And so I think that navigation depends on a few factors. Number one, where am I? Am I anchored in my truth? Am I anchored and grounded? And have I practiced my own emotional regulation long enough, deeply enough to know that those who have hurt me don't have the power to pull me back into the battle? They don't have the power to convince me of the lies. I don't feel crazy around them. I don't feel like there's something wrong with me around them, but I also don't feel like there's something wrong with them. I realize that there's deep woundedness in the human condition that we don't fully understand. And some people who have been wounded bring that woundedness into relationships with others. And some people who have been wounded become great healers and sages and saints and mystics and shamans. I don't know why that happens as it does. But that navigation for me became carrying this anger that kept me separate from those who had hurt me. I couldn't be in the same room with them. I couldn't participate. I certainly couldn't hug them. I couldn't, and that was painful for my whole family system because nobody understood why Jules was never around when they came around, or why their children and my children don't know each other, or why I chose not to have them into my family home once I was married and having children. I didn't want them around my children. Nobody understood that. And so I looked like the problem. I looked like the bad guy, keeping our family apart. What was wrong with Jules? So I had to work through that narrative that had come down through our lineage and our family about myself, that I did exactly what I needed to do until I was ready to do something different. And when I was ready to do something different, I completely forgave them. Completely. I have no anger or angst. I have nothing in my body. I have sadness, I have grief, and I have loss. I have a desire to understand them. I have reached out many times asking for conversation in a safe space with somebody who could help us navigate the conversation. There's never been a response. I would invite that. I would like to know how our family kind of landed the way we did when we did. And they've chosen not to respond. They've chosen to continue to be angry and live in their narrative, which is their truth, but certainly not mine, certainly not my truth. And so that way I navigated it had to change. For those who don't have a choice, this is really hard. When you're still living in a home, perhaps where there's someone who has wounded you, and for many reasons don't have the option yet to not be in the home or in the presence. This is where I believe working with someone who can help you anchor in to your truth, regardless of how uncertain the world around you is. Because when their trauma, what has happened to them, becomes our trauma because they perpetrate it on us. Now their trauma is our trauma. That trauma bond that happens, that cord between us becomes so convoluted and confusing and complex that we can't see it clearly. We'll stay in toxic relationships. We'll stay in relationships with narcissists. We will stay in relationships with our abusers because we can't see it clearly. And I just want you to hear, if you're hearing these words and something I'm saying is resonating for you, listen to that. If you're listening to Renata or me or others who speak about this and you're thinking, oh, yes, that's what happens for me. Just be in that for a moment. Just honor that truth that is speaking to you and invite that wisdom to continue to speak to you. And please find someone safe. Find someone safe who you can decide if you trust. Reach out to Renata after this program. She's got resources she can direct you to, but listen to that for yourself so that you can navigate. How can I, if I choose to stay in relationship to this person, still protect myself? How do I protect myself? How can I learn to anchor in to myself if I'm still in relationship? And you may choose that. You may have to choose it. You may choose to choose it. There's no right, wrong, good or bad. We all make our choices. But I think navigating it does require anchoring into our own truth so we don't continue to lose ourselves to the people who have wounded us. For many people I work with, that means no contact. That means having to go complete no contact as they strengthen their own regulatory system. And perhaps then when, as I did, when I was ready, I reached back out wanting contact in a loving way, but there was no response from them. I can still anchor into that. I feel loss and grief, but I don't feel ashamed anymore, right? So I think from no contact to partial contact to forced contact, we navigate it first by learning to anchor into ourselves, our own narrative, our own sense of empowerment, owning this story and owning what we choose, how we choose to be in relationship to them, that we take back that power. That's the power we lost. That's the trauma external to us, but lives internal. And so anchoring back into your new narrative, the narrative that you own, that you write, that you create, the chapter that's yours to write, not theirs, then we can navigate those relationships with more clarity, more conscious clarity around protecting ourselves and finding the truth.
Jules, your strength, your wisdom, your light, and your inner quietness transcend thousands of miles that separate us and just reach here. So thank you for that. And please do tell people who are listening to us where they can more listen to what you have to offer, or where we can find you.
Thank you, Renata, and thank you for your service. So you can find us a couple of ways. I think the easiest and most general is to find us online at simplyhealingwithjules.com. Just Simply Healing with Jules, JULES.com. And that will provide for you every avenue of contact and ways that you can participate in our healing circles at no cost to you. You can join women from around the world who come together once a month with me to continue this journey. I love the mutual benefit and the reciprocity of women's healing circles, especially when there's no fee involved. It's just a safe space to come to. And there are other resources on that website as well. So thanks for asking, Renata.
I'm going to put that into the notes. Thank you, Jules. Thank you.
Thank you, Renata. Blessings.